Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about layout panes. Now, JavaFX provides many types of panes for organizing nodes in a container. These are the base pane class, which is the base class for all layout panes. It contains the getChildren method, which returns a observable list of nodes in the pane. We have the stack pane class, which places the nodes on top of each other and in the center of the pane. We have the flow pane class, which places the nodes row by row horizontally or column by column vertically. And we have the grid pane class, which places the nodes in the cells in a two-dimensional grid. Then we have the border pane class, which places the nodes in the top, right, bottom, and left, and then in the center regions. And then we have the hbox and vbox classes, which respectively place the nodes in a single row and single column. We're actually going to be talking about all of these classes in detail. However, we've already talked about the base pane class and the stack pane class extensively, so we'll just start our extensive discussions with the flow pane class. Hopefully you recall that when we used the base pane class, it was just a canvas for displaying very basic shapes. It's the base class for all specialized panes though, which is what makes it important. And we use the stack pane when we want to put the button that didn't take up the entire screen. The nodes are placed in the center of a stack pane, and each pane contains a list for holding nodes in that pane, and hopefully you recall that that list is an instance of observable list, which can be obtained using the getChildren method. But when you add a node to a stack pane, it just gets added on in the center of the pane. So you can't have something in the left and the right side of the pane. Everything goes in the center. With that, we can now get started with the flow pane. The flow pane arranges the nodes in the pane horizontally from left to right or vertically from top to bottom in the order in which they were added. When a row or column is filled, a new row or column is started. You can specify the way that the nodes are placed horizontally or vertically using one of two constants. Either you would say orientation.horizontal, where every single letter in horizontal is capitalized, or you would say orientation.vertical, where every single letter in vertical is capitalized. This would indicate you want it to either be filled horizontally or vertically. You can also specify the gap between the nodes in the pixels. This is the proper terminology for this is called the hgap and vgap for horizontal and vertical gap. The class diagram of the scene class is that there are 4 private data fields that all have their respective getter methods. This is an immutable class. These are alignment, which tells us the overall alignment of the content in this pane. Normally it's going to be set to the left side, so it'll fill left. And we have the orientation data field, which by default is horizontal. So it'll start from the left and fill left to right by default. Then you have the hgap and vgap properties, which are all binding properties, which can be used to tie something so that when you insert something new, there'll always be a certain gap in between them. And we have 4 constructors. These are the default flow pane. We have the flow pane with the specified hgap and vgap, both of which are doubles. We have the flow pane with the specified orientation, and then we have the flow pane with the specified orientation followed by its hgap and vgap. So, before we get started on implementing this, we have to talk about the data fields alignment, orientation, hgap, and vgap, since they're all binding properties. Now, it's important to remember that every single binding property in JavaFX has its getter method, the value getter method that is, like getHgap, that returns the value, a setter method such as setHgap, which for setting a value, and a getter method that returns the property itself, such as hgap property. For a data field of the object property t type, which the alignment and variety of things are in this case, the value getter method returns the value of the type t, and the property getter method returns the property value of the type, object property type t. So let's get started. We're actually going to create a new class file today, since we want to keep our programs distinct and we don't want to have 5 windows. That becomes a little bit unwieldy. So we're just going to keep all of our panes in one window. It's going to be called show panes. Inside show panes, we have to make sure we have our main method. And before we do anything else, we're going to have what we need in our main method, which is to say the application.launch, and then the args will be passed. You'll notice it auto imports the application class. We also have to import a couple more classes. We have to import the JavaFX.geometry.insetStackPane to allow us to have spaces, we have to import the JavaFX .scene to allow us to have scenes. We have to make sure we import JavaFX .scene .control .label to allow us to have labels. We have to make sure that we import the JavaFX.scene.control.text field as well, since that'll allow us to have a text field inside our displayed flow pane. We also have to make sure, finally, that we import the flow pane class. And we'll be adding to this flow pane, we'll be importing more pane classes later on, but for now, all we need is the layout.flowPane. And if there's one location you might want to use a wildcard import, it might be here, since that would allow you to cut down the amount of import statements you might have. Finally, we have to have the stage class that allows us to have a stage to display all of these other classes. And with that, we're now ready to get started with our pane test. However, once again, as with all of our JavaFX classes, we have to make sure we extend the application class so that we can override the start method. And we're going to say public void start with the stage primary start. Primary stage. And inside our method, we can now get started with creating our first flow pane object. This flow pane object is just going to be a basic flow pane. All we're going to do with it is we're not going to specify any sort of hgap, vgap initially. We'll add those in later using the respective methods. So we're going to say flow pane is equal to a new flow pane. Nothing new there. And then we can now start setting the padding. Hopefully you recall that padding is the way we separate a small barrier from the edge of the window to where we want our other nodes to be. The padding works so that it reads top, right, bottom, left. So we actually want to have a padding of 11 on the top, 12 on the right, 13 on the bottom, and 14 on the left. And remember, it reads clockwise, starting at the top. So we're going to say pane.setPadding. And this is a method that's set in the pane class, so every subclass of the pane class, including the flow pane class, inherits it. We're going to provide a new insets, and we're going to provide 11, 12, 13, 14. There is a constructor that allows us to set the padding for new insets where every single inset is the same. So if you needed the padding to be identical, let's say every single edge you wanted to be 12 pixels, then you could just say new insets 12, and that would assume that every single side would have a padding of 12. Then we need to set our hgap and vgap. Now remember, the hgap and vgap are what determines the spacing in between two nodes. In this case, we're going to be determining the spacing between some labels and some text fields. So we want the hgap, let's say, to be equal to 5, and we want our vgap to be equal to 5 as well. This is 5 pixels, remember. So we're going to say pane.setVgap, and we'll provide a value of 5. And then the same thing for the hgap. We're going to say pane.setHgap, and we're going to provide a value of 5 again, since we still want the hgap to be equal to 5. After this, we can now get started on adding some of those labels and some of those text fields. What we're looking to do today is we're going to create a small window that will be able to take in the user's first name, last name, and middle initial. However, we're not going to do anything with this data. We're just going to be taking it in, and it's going to act like it's going to be almost a dummy window where they can type something in, but it won't really affect anything else. The way to do this is we're going to say pane.getChildren so that we get that observable list, which we're going to be modifying and adding to with a variety of labels and text fields. So we're going to say add all, since we need to make sure we add multiple things here. To do that, we're going to add first a new label. This new label is going to say first name. This will just be the way this is going to work is that it'll say first name, colon, then it'll have a text field. It'll say middle initial, colon, then have a text box, pretty much, to allow the user to put in their first name and middle initial, respectively. Then a last name, which allows the user to enter their last name inside a text field again. So now that we've provided the appropriate label, we can now add in that text field, because remember, it's going to read left to right, so we have to insert the things in the order we'd like them. And since we like to say first name, then the space for then the text box, we have to then insert the new text field. This new text field doesn't need any parameters on it since we're not going to be passing anything to the text field. All we need is just an empty text field. It doesn't need to store anything even. It just needs to sit there. And then we need a new label. This label is going to say MI. This will represent the middle initial, since middle initial is quite long and we want to cut down the amount of space we're taking up in the window, and you'll see why in a little bit. After that though, we can now create a text field object. The reason we're going to create a text field object here, and we're going to call it TFMI, to stand for text field middle initial, that'll be equal to a new text field. The reason we're creating a specific object instead of creating an anonymous object is because we want to be able to specify the preferred column. You see, we have two options here. We can either say that we want the middle initial to be anywhere. We can say that we want the middle initial is fine wherever it is. It could be on a separate line, it could be on the same line as the first name, it could be on the same line as the last name, it doesn't matter. However, it really makes a lot more sense to, if you have a choice, put something in the same line as the first name, since the first name and middle initial are more tightly coupled than the middle initial and last name. So, to do this, we can set the preferred column. This will mean that if it has a choice, if necessary, and if possible, it'll always put the middle initial text box, or text field in this case, on the same line as the first name, where the preferred column is going to be 1, because the 0th column will be the first name, and the first column will be the middle initial. So to do that, we're going to say TFMI dot set pref column, and you'll see it's right here, and we're going to set that column value to 1 because we want, if we have a choice, we want the first name text box, then middle initial text box to be on the same line. This will only be possible if the window is appropriately resized, but we want it, we're going to leave it like this so that it is. After that, we have to have our last name. The last name is going to be fairly simple, and we can use the add all since the last name doesn't need any special modifications. We can just use anonymous import. We can use anonymous objects there again. So we're going to say pane.getChildren, and then we're going to add to this, or we're going to add all in this case since we want to add multiple elements, and we're going to add TFMI first because we want, again, we need to insert these left to right in the order we'd like to see them. Then we have to add in our new label, last name, and the new text field. So we're just going to say new label, and we'll provide the last name string, and then we need to provide the text field to allow the user to enter their own last name. We'll separate that out by a comma, and we'll say new text field with no parameters. And this is going to be anonymous since, once again, we don't need to modify this after it's been created. Now that we've done all this, we can now just display this back out to the user. Now remember, even though this pane has a variety of nodes in it, because we have a pane, all we need to do is we can just add it into the scene, and we only need to add one thing to the scene, this pane. So we're going to say scene, and we call this scene, is equal to a new scene with the pane 200 and 250, since it should be longer than it is tall. And you'll see why. We will be able to resize the window, but initially you'll see why we have a relatively small size. It's because the first name, middle initial, and last name won't take up too much space, so we should make it as physically small as possible. Then we're going to say our normal set title, set scene, and show. So we're going to say primary stage dot set title and we'll provide the title of, let's say, show flow pane. Then we'll set the scene, and we'll provide the scene that we've created that contains the pane and therefore all of the nodes we've created inside that pane. And then we'll display this back out by saying primary stage dot show. So if you look at this program, you can see what we've done. We've created a show panes class, and inside this class we've created a new flow pane. We've set the padding to specified indices at the top, left, or top, right, bottom, and left. Then we've set the h-gap and v-gap, and then we've added labels, text fields, and we've modified one of the text fields so that if it has a choice, it'll be on the same level as the first name. And then we've added those also, the text field for the middle initial and the last name, and the last name's text field, into the pane again, and then we just display the pane using a scene. So let's run our program, and let's see this in action. You can now see how this works. It says first name, middle initial, and then it has our space, and then the last name. Now you might be looking at this and saying, well, why is it like this? I thought we set the preferential column to be 1. And in fact, it shouldn't be. This is because of how small the window is. If we resize our window, you'll notice it starts moving around because the pane is set to it'll automatically shift the way it looks depending on the size of the window. So you'll notice in almost every circumstance that is possible, the middle initial will always stay with the first name, and that middle initial text field most importantly. However, if it becomes too small, then the middle initial, as it was initially, will just be put onto the same line, it'll be put onto its own line or on the same line as the last name. In theory, we want it to look something like this. This is the optimal way of designing it, since it's appropriately wide, and in theory we should actually change this so that it looks, if we have this correct pixel count from the beginning. That way we can enter our first name, we can enter our middle initial on the same line, and then we can enter our last name on the next line, since that's more different than the first name and middle initial. And with that, in the interest of time, I'm actually going to conclude this lesson here. In the next few lessons, we're going to be talking about the grid pane, the border pane, and the HBox and VBox classes, which will again be panes that will allow us to modify our nodes so that they better fit the situation. Hopefully you found this lesson useful, and hopefully you're able to leverage the various panes we've talked about in your own code.